Hey everyone, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is your first time tuning in to this podcast show, then thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and then continue listening into future episodes. Today's episode, I'm going to be covering what I think is a rather interesting topic and its role in endurance sport. It's known as the placebo effect, and it tends to pop up in ways that athletes and coaches might not necessarily always be acutely aware of. But it's a topic or a phenomenon that's gotten a lot more attention, especially in the research literature as of late, because it can potentially play such a large role in some of the positive effects that athletes see when they engage in like a training plan, or they use a different, or if they use a product or a certain supplement. Just intervening in any way as an athlete, the placebo effect might play more of a role in some of the improvements that you see than you might otherwise be aware of. Now, when most people hear of the word placebo, they tend to think of drug trials or clinical trials in which, you might have two groups that are in a research study. One group gets drug A, which is the actual drug that the researchers are studying, and then drug B might be the placebo drug, or the sugar pill is sometimes what it's been commonly referred to as. And we normally think of that second drug, or the sugar pill, as being the placebo, as the one that has no effect whatsoever on the research participants, whereas the actual drug that we're studying is going to elicit the effects. And that's kind of why we give the placebo drug to the other group, to the control group, so that we can compare the effects of the actual drug to essentially nothing. But you're still giving those participants something so that they aren't aware of whether or not they're getting the actual drug or not. So normally in drug trials or in clinical research, it's really important to have a placebo group, or otherwise known as a control group, so that you can effectively compare the actual intervention group to something. And so essentially you'd expect that when you give a control group some type of placebo, whether it's a drug or a supplement or a placebo treatment, that they're not going to see any improvements by you giving them that sham intervention. And then the group that you obviously give the actual intervention to, you would hope to see some type of improvement or change that you're looking for. So that's what most people tend to think of when they hear the word placebo. But the word placebo can work its way into other areas outside of just drug trials and different medical-related clinical research studies. And so the placebo effect, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, can work its way into endurance sport and can play more of a role in some of the positive changes and improvements that we see than a lot of coaches and athletes might be aware of. And I'm going to help illustrate this with a few different examples as well as I talk throughout this podcast. But first, we should probably try and start by defining the placebo effect, or what the heck is the placebo effect. In more technical terms, the placebo effect is observed essentially any time that you administer something to an individual that might otherwise not have any real physiological or biological basis for eliciting any type of change, but it ends up leading to some type of change. And in more simpler terms, that means essentially if you give something to someone that you know doesn't cause any type of change in their performance, if we're talking about an athlete, but they end up seeing an immediate improvement in their performance, or an improvement in their performance over time, then that's essentially what the placebo effect is. And now the placebo effect essentially comes down to psychology, but more specifically, someone's belief that something is going to work. And so I'm going to give a few different examples here that'll help illustrate a couple of the different ways in which the placebo effect can show up in endurance sport and within athletes. And you're going to notice a common theme throughout some of these examples, that it all kind of boils down to how strongly an individual or an athlete believes in whatever it is that they're doing. So even if something doesn't necessarily have any scientific evidence or theoretical basis or rationale for improving something, if an athlete believes strongly enough that something does, then there's the potential that athlete will see some improvement from whatever it is that they're using or doing. And that's essentially the placebo effect. So it's when you basically see a change in an outcome when that change in an outcome wouldn't otherwise be anticipated. So let me give you a few different examples that will help illustrate the placebo effect. So let's say we're talking about caffeine. So caffeine is a well-known ergogenic or performance-enhancing substance. It's legal for the most part unless you go over a certain amount in competition. But for the most part, a lot of athletes, especially on race day, and if you're doing, a triathlon or a running race or a cycling race, a lot of athletes will have caffeine, whether it's before the race or even during the race. So caffeine, very legal performance-enhancing substance that a lot of athletes take advantage of. So now let's say we have two different groups of athletes and they're going out to do a 1,500 meter running race. One group gets a small white pill, or actually both groups get small white pills that look exactly the same, but one group has a pill that contains caffeine and the other group just gets, we'll just say, a sugar pill. So a pill that's just sugar and doesn't have any kind of caffeine in it whatsoever. So that one would be the placebo group, right? The caffeinated group is the intervention group, and the placebo group would be the group that gets the sugar pill. Now, what you might expect would be that those who got the caffeine would go out and they might see an improvement in their performance, whereas those who don't get the caffeine and they just get the sugar pill, they don't necessarily see an improvement in their performance compared to their baseline. But what we oftentimes see, especially in the research literature as it's being studied more and more in recent decades, is that oftentimes those that are given the placebo treatment tend to also see an improvement in their performance. And so there's a few different review papers that have been published, especially in this past decade, that have aimed to investigate just how strong of an effect the placebo effect is in athletes. But there was a really good one back in 2011 that looked at, I think it was like 14 or 15 different studies across about 200 different athletes. And within all of those studies, there was an intervention group, and then there was also a placebo control group. And these studies were looking at outcomes across a variety of different types of sports and substances that they were administering in the intervention group. But essentially the goal of this paper was just to summarize the effect that the placebo had on the athletes. And essentially, this paper found that the placebo intervention in and of itself elicited small to moderate improvements in performance across a variety of different endurance-related measures and strength and power-related measures. And so the placebo effect in and of itself can be strong enough to where you actually do see a small or a moderate improvement in performance. Sometimes an improvement in performance that almost matches what you're giving the intervention group. So if we go back to the example of the caffeine versus no caffeine for the 1,500 meter running racers, you might see the group that got the caffeine improve their performance, but those that didn't get the caffeine and just got the placebo might also improve their performance, sometimes almost as much as the group that got the caffeine. Now, the wording of how you word the placebo to the group that's getting it is also important as well. So let's say, for example, both groups got the same white pill again, but we told both groups that they're getting caffeine, but one group, of course, isn't getting it. So the group who was told they're getting caffeine but isn't might see more of a placebo effect on their performance because they're getting something that they think is going to enhance their performance. Whereas if you gave both groups just a generic white pill and didn't really tell them what it was, but one group got caffeine, one group didn't, then you might not see quite as strong of a placebo effect in that actual placebo group. And so again, this is getting at the notion that an athlete's belief in what they're doing, and if they strongly believe that it's going to work for them and it's going to improve their performance, then there's more of a chance that it will. And that's the placebo effect at work. So it's not that placebo pill that had, let's just say, sugar in it, had any real physiological basis for improving their performance. It's more so that the athlete believed that what they were ingesting was going to improve their performance, and therefore their belief stimulated a variety of different physiological or biological downstream mechanisms that ended up improving their performance. And so actually sometimes it's pretty interesting what you can see in some research studies that look at this exact topic, caffeine versus no caffeine, or a caffeinated group versus a non-caffeinated placebo group, is that when you tell a group that they're getting caffeine but you don't give them caffeine, they end up getting a similar response, a physiological response, as if they were actually getting caffeine. So if you've ever had caffeine before, you know that caffeine is a stimulant, and so it normally increases your heart rate and your respiration rate. And that normally lowers your rating of perceived exertion when you're doing intense exercise. And caffeine is a known ergogenic substance, especially for helping to improve performance in short races like a 1500 meter race, all the way up to like long distance endurance races like a marathon or half Ironman or even an Ironman. But when you give people something that doesn't have caffeine, but you tell them that it does, they tend to see similar physiological responses as, say, another group who actually got caffeine. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it comes down to just the belief that the athlete is getting the caffeine. And so especially if the athlete has had caffeine before and they know what it feels like to have caffeine, just that belief that they're getting caffeine is powerful enough to stimulate an actual physiological response. And then it's that physiological response that obviously helps aid their performance. So it's a really, really interesting phenomenon, and something that's being more and more understood, especially in recent decades, as we've become more and more aware of the placebo effect and how powerful it can be. And obviously it kind of wreaks havoc to some extent in research studies where researchers don't necessarily want the placebo group to see any kind of improvement, because then it kind of essentially messes up their data analysis when they go to analyze the data, and both groups have improved, whereas they've expected the placebo group to not improve and the intervention group to improve. So it's a little bit of a problem for researchers sometimes, but it's something that, now that we understand it a little bit more, it's very applicable and relevant to athletes, and especially to endurance sport athletes, because it demonstrates just how powerful the belief in a product or a substance or an approach is when it comes to eliciting improvements in performance. So that's one example, and that might be a more obvious example than this next one that I'm going to cover, but I wanted to cover another example because this is another way in which the placebo effect can show up for athletes. And this one is especially relevant for coaches because it comes down to wording and how you phrase things. And so this example is maybe a little bit more relevant for coaches. Not that first example I gave you isn't relevant for coaches, because obviously both coaches and athletes should be aware that that belief in something is a powerful driver for improvement. So whether you're an athlete yourself or if you're a coach working with athletes, it's important to understand that if an athlete believes that something is going to work, even if they're using something that might not necessarily have any physiological or biological basis for improving their performance, if it has no harmful side effects and they're okay doing it, then, and if they believe it works, then it very well might work for the athlete. But the second example is a little bit different. So this second example, I'm going to use the idea of a taper leading into a race. So let's say we have two different scenarios, but both scenarios involve a coach discussing a taper strategy with an athlete. So in the first example, we have a coach who just gives the athlete, say, a taper 2 weeks out from a big race leading into the competition, but they don't necessarily talk with the athlete about the taper and the benefits of the taper. They just simply write the taper strategy down in their training plan, and they remind the athlete that, hey, we're a few weeks out from a race and we have a taper going into the big race in a couple weeks. And then the athlete follows the taper strategy and they go into the race a couple weeks later. Now in the second scenario, we have a coach who puts that same taper strategy in to the athlete's training plan, but they take 20 to 30 minutes and sit down with the athlete. They go over the taper strategy in great detail, and then they also talk to the athlete about the documented benefits that a well-executed taper has on their performance. And so in the research literature, it's well documented that a properly executed taper can elicit a 2 to 3 to 4 to 5% improvement in performance come race day, which is huge, especially for athletes that are maybe more on the elite end of the spectrum that are trying to get at the top of their age group, or if they're a professional, if they're trying to get on the podium as a professional. just a couple percentage points improvement can be huge. And so for a coach to sit down and talk with an athlete about the specifics of exactly how the taper can benefit them, and to back that up with research or evidence that suggests that the taper can actually improve their performance, is going to help that athlete believe and buy into the process a lot more than if the coach didn't necessarily go over some of those details and discuss some of the research and the evidence that supports a properly executed taper and its effects on performance. And so what oftentimes we see in the research is that when someone words an approach that they're using in a favorable light, and they back it up with strong, positive, and powerful statements about the benefits that approach is going to have, we tend to see a greater effect on the actual outcome that we're looking at. So when a coach conveys to an athlete that the approach that they're taking, let's say in this case with a taper, is going to have a good and positive effect on their performance, it helps the athlete buy into it more and believe in it more. And then again, that belief in what the athlete is doing is huge. It's critical. If the athlete believes that something is going to work, even if it does actually have a physiological basis for improving their performance, like a taper does, just the athlete believing in it is going to help augment the effects that taper is going to have. So they're almost going to see like more of an effect because now they're also believing in something that has real evidence to back it up. And so for coaches, this is huge, because getting the athlete to believe and to buy into whatever it is that you're having them do is huge for their success. So you could have the most well thought out and meticulously developed training plan on planet Earth, but if the athlete doesn't necessarily trust what you're giving them and questions everything and doesn't believe it, then the athlete isn't going to see nearly as much success than if they were bought into everything that you were giving them and they were really believing in you and trusting in you. And so for coaches, this is huge, but for athletes, it's huge as well. So if you're an athlete and you're coaching yourself, but you're doing all these things in your training, but you don't necessarily believe in yourself, or you don't believe in what you're doing, then you're also not going to get as much out of your training to improve your performance as you otherwise could have if you really, really deeply believed in yourself and whatever approach you were taking and the different strategies you were using, the different recovery techniques you were using and the different products you were using. So belief in what you're doing is important. And so for a coach, it's important to convey a message in a way that gets the athlete to believe in what the coach is trying to get them to do. And then on the athlete's end of the spectrum, it's important that they believe in whatever they're doing. So that belief is a powerful thing and will help improve an athlete's performance. Whether or not what they're doing has any evidence to support that it's going to improve performance, or if it does have evidence to show that it can improve performance. So now that I've given you a few examples, I just wanted to point out one thing that I know some people might be thinking, which is essentially, why would we care if anything has any evidence to show that it works if all we need is belief in something? And so this might lead some athletes to think that, well, I don't necessarily need to follow, evidence to suggest what the best approaches might be, when I can just do whatever I want as long as I believe strongly enough in it. And while yes, this is true to some extent in the sense that you don't necessarily always need evidence to back up every single thing you do. So if an athlete does and I'll give a good example here, so recovery boots, or like the Normatec boots, or there are a couple of other big brands out there that make those recovery boots. There's extremely little evidence to suggest that those recovery boots do anything substantial or anything that they claim that they're supposed to do. So there's really no research yet that's documented that they have any physiological effects on enhancing recovery. But yet you see them all over the place. Like professional athletes use them, amateur athletes use them, and some athletes will swear by it in terms of it improving their recovery. So this is a good example of something that isn't necessarily harmful to use. So like using recovery boots obviously isn't really going to harm anyone, or at least not that we know of. And even if there's no evidence to demonstrate that it works, if an athlete does it day in and day out and believes that using those recovery boots is going to help them out, then it's likely helping them out. They're probably seeing some type of physiological change or enhancement in their recovery or their performance because of their belief in that product. So in some circumstances, it's not necessarily the biggest deal in the world if the athlete is doing something that doesn't have any evidence to support it, but yet they really believe in it. Using compression socks during competition is another one. So a lot of athletes will use compression socks during competition because they believe it's helping their performance. And there are a variety of claims that compression sock companies will make to claim that it improves their performance, but a lot of those claims are really scientifically unfounded and don't have a lot of evidence to support them. But again, some athletes will use them on race day and they swear by it and they feel that it's improving their performance on race day. And that's totally fine because as far as we know, compression socks don't really hurt performance. The only downside, again, to using products like that is that the athlete has to spend money on them. But if the athlete is okay spending money on it and they want to use it and they believe in it, then that's fine. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be fine if a coach or an athlete was engaging in a strategy or a practice, or if they were using a product that was harmful, but they believe that it worked. Because if it is actually physiologically harmful, now obviously that's a line that's been crossed, and the athlete should stop using it, or the coach should stop trying to implement that strategy or that approach, regardless of whether or not the athlete believes in it. But the ideal case scenario for both athletes and coaches is to use the best available evidence and research we have to back up what we're doing. So for example, a properly periodized training plan, using the best available evidence we have to back up our periodization approach when we're working with athletes and their training plans is the best approach. But then on top of that, we also want to convey to the athlete, or the athlete wants to be able to believe and buy into the systematic approach that they're doing or that the coach is giving to them. So that's like the ideal case scenario, is that we're using evidence-based approaches and products and strategies while also getting the athlete to buy into and believe what they're doing. So that kind of two-pronged approach is the best way to go about it, rather than just doing a bunch of things that have no evidence to support them and then just believing that it's going to work. Because while that belief might help you in certain circumstances and might help you see a little bit of some benefit here and there, believing in a product or an approach that actually has evidence to back it up is only going to make that approach or that product more beneficial for the athlete. And so, again, just belief in something alone isn't enough to just chuck evidence out the window and say, well, I don't need, evidence-based approaches. I can just do whatever I want as long as I believe in it. Because I know some people might hear this and they might go down that rabbit hole as well. So that's the placebo effect essentially in a nutshell. So it's essentially when someone sees an improvement in something that otherwise might not necessarily, or it's when an athlete sees an improvement in something when they're using a product or an approach or a strategy that might otherwise not have any evidence to suggest that it improves performance, yet they see some type of positive performance enhancement anyways. But then again, also it's an athlete's belief in something that helps to augment or further enhance the benefits that they're seeing from something that does have evidence to back it up. So there's kind of two different ways in which it can show up. And so I covered a couple different examples to help illustrate the effects of the placebo effect at work and how it can relate to endurance sport. And obviously, like I mentioned before, this topic is relevant for both coaches and athletes. So athletes to be able to understand why they're seeing improvements in something is important, as well as having a coach understand it so that they can better understand how to word and phrase things when they're discussing different strategies or approaches or products with athletes is also important as well. And again, it all comes down to belief. So whether you're an athlete yourself or whether you're a coach working with athletes, believing in the approach that you're using or the strategy that you're using is important for eliciting positive improvements in performance. So hopefully this podcast episode was useful for you, whether you are a coach or an athlete, or if you're both. Hopefully you got something out of this and learned just a little bit more about the placebo effect and some of the ways that it can show up in endurance sport. I'll be sure to link into the show notes below a written post that I have in our VO2 Max forum in which I discuss this exact same topic, the placebo effect and its role in endurance sport. It covers a lot of what I talked about in this podcast episode, just in written format. But there's a few more details in there that I may or may not have covered in this podcast episode. And so if you want a little bit more information on the placebo effect and you want to read a little bit more about it, you can click on the link that'll take you to that written post. And then in there, I also have references as well that I've cited and I've used those references in the making of that written post as well as in the making of this podcast. So you can obviously read a little bit more about it in those citations as well, and get a feel for a little bit more about what the research literature tells us as well. So again, hope you found this podcast episode useful. And if this was your first time listening to the VO2 Max podcast, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And then I hope you continue tuning in for future episodes. Until the next episode, happy training and racing. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.